All right. Well, we've been in the middle of a sermon series this morning and the past few weeks, and for the next couple weeks, for the rest of the year, we're going to be in the middle of a sermon series on the life of Jesus. What he was about, what he said, what did the people around him say, what are some of the things that he did. We're just going to follow Jesus around. And this week, we're going to look at something really interesting, really exciting, because this week we're going to get to see Jesus deal with something that really all of us deal with. We're going to get to see how Jesus responds to temptation. Temptation. Something that was very intriguing to me, and something I'm sure is very intriguing to you, because I struggle with temptation, and you struggle with temptation. We all struggle with this idea of temptation. And so how neat would it be, how exciting would it be to see how the Son of God handles being tempted? Now, before we get into this, we need to get some terms right. When I say temptation, that's not the same thing as sin, okay? Understand that being tempted doesn't make you a bad person. We're about to talk about Jesus being tempted, okay? So I don't think many of us would be like, yeah, Jesus, what a bad guy. No, he was perfect, okay? So being tempted doesn't make you a bad person. In fact, in Greek, the word is peirazo, which just it can mean a good thing or a bad thing. It can be a test or a temptation. So it doesn't inherently mean something negative. But the opportunity is there to do something negative. So we all struggle with this opportunity, this opportunity to sin, the proclivity to sin. We all have that about us. So what do? What did Jesus do when temptation came his way? I think it would be beneficial for us to look at how the Son of God treats temptation. So that's what we're going to do this morning. We'll be in the book of Luke, Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4, we're going to be starting in verse 1. This event takes place right after the baptism of Jesus. That event in Matthew and Mark, they're right next to each other. In Luke, they're separated by a genealogy. But as far as events go, this is the next thing. The temptation of Jesus is the next thing that happens after his baptism. And at his baptism, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. I've seen, pictures of that and things of that. It says that when Jesus was baptized, the heavens opened up and the Spirit of God came down like a dove and descended on him. It's that very cheesy movie, like shaft of light coming down on Jesus and, that kind of thing. That's what's going on. And God says, and in that text, when Jesus gets baptized, God says, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." So Jesus gets baptized, and there's this moment where God speaks, and he says, "This is my Son. I love him. I'm very happy with him." And then we get the next thing that happens is verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1. This is the next thing that happens. Then Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, we know that, we got that, we saw the Spirit come down on him. Then Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan River. He was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he was tempted by the devil for 40 days. Jesus ate nothing all that time and became very hungry. So here's what happens. Jesus gets baptized. God says, "You're my Son. I love you. I'm very happy with you. Now come with me." So Jesus says, "Okay, where are we going?" He says, "We're going to go out into the desert." "Okay, what are we doing out there?" "You're going to be tempted." "But I thought you loved me." "No, I do." "I thought you were happy with me." "No, I am." "So what are we doing?" "I'm going to take you into the desert, and you're going to be tempted." Jesus was led by God into the desert to have a very difficult time. That sometimes we get this in our head that when we struggle, when you're struggling with temptation, when you're struggling with something and you think, "Why is this so hard for me? Why is this such a struggle for me?" That somehow that makes you a lesser Christian, a lesser person. Like a holier person, a more righteous person would be just, temptation come their way and just bam, deflect it off. No big deal, just not even a worry. That somehow if you really have to dig in and struggle with something, that makes you somehow less righteous. And yet Jesus was led by God to the wilderness to be tempted. And that sometimes when you struggle, that doesn't mean that you're less. It actually might mean that you're more. It actually might mean that you're actually on the right track, and Satan comes along and says, "I need to do something to throw him off." It doesn't make you less of a Christian because you struggle, or less of a follower. Jesus was led by God into the desert to be tempted. Then this is how the temptations go. We're real familiar with the first one, the other two, not so much. Verse 3, then the devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become a loaf of bread." But Jesus told him, "No, the scriptures say people do not live by bread alone." Then the devil took him up and revealed to him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. "I will give you the glory of all these kingdoms and authority over them," the devil said, "because they are mine to give to anyone I please." I will give it all to you if you will worship me." Jesus replied, "The scriptures say you must worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil took him to Jerusalem, to the highest point in the temple, and said, "If you are the Son of God, jump off." That's not a very good temptation, I don't think, but maybe for him was. "If you are the Son of God, jump off. For the scriptures say he will order his angels to protect and guard you, and they will hold you up with their hands so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone." And Jesus responded, "The scriptures also say you must not test the Lord your God." When the devil had finished tempting Jesus, he left him until the next opportunity came. Now, some of you, the more astute ones of you, the ones who have, some can pick some stuff up, and might have noticed how in those temptation accounts, when Jesus is being tempted there, the things that Jesus was tempted there with doesn't sound real relevant to us. It's real neat. It's great. I'm glad we get this kind of behind the scenes look, this personal look at how Jesus deals with temptation. But the things he was tempted with there, I don't know. I don't think many of us are going to be tempted with turning stones into bread. That's not ever happened to me yet, and I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think too many of us are going to be tempted with jumping off a high place. That's real struggle and temptation. It seems really fun. I don't think many of us are going to struggle with being tempted with all the kingdoms of the earth. Hey, you can have all the kingdoms. I don't know if many of us have that in our future. So while it's great that we get to see kind of behind the scenes of Jesus dealing with temptation and what does he do in response to it, I don't know. It doesn't really seem like this is all that relevant. But you see, here's the deal. At the heart, at the center of every single one of Jesus' temptations, what the bottom line of every single one of Jesus' temptations is the exact same message that's at the heart of every temptation you will ever face. And it's this question: do you trust God? Do you trust God? At the heart of every temptation that Jesus faced, and at the heart of every temptation you will ever face in your life is the question: do you trust God? Let's look at the temptations again. In chapter 4, verse 3, this is what it says. "Then the devil said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become a loaf of bread.'" And here's the temptation there. That what Satan is saying is you don't need to suffer. You don't need to suffer like this. You don't need to do this. See, God told Jesus, we're going to go out into the wilderness for a while. While you're out here, you're going to fast. So Jesus hasn't eaten anything for a long time. Okay? And that hurts, that's painful. He's actually giving up something he needs, like food, in order to kind of teach, in order to kind of learn to discipline himself that as much as I need food, I need God more. That's all fasting is. That's what you do is you give up something that you need because you want to teach yourself, as much as I need this, my body needs food, but you know what? I'm able to give that up because I need God more. You teach yourself, I need God more. Jesus is out there doing that, and Satan comes along and he says, you know what? You're the Son of God. You don't need to do that. You don't need to give this up. You don't need to suffer like this. You don't need to go through this. You don't need to do any of this. In fact, when he says, if you're the Son of God there, that word if is actually a conditional statement. It really can be translated since just as easily. And you know what? A verse ago, a chapter ago, God told Jesus, you're my son. I don't really think the temptation was, are you sure you're God's son? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. A couple weeks ago, God spoke to me and said, hey, you're my boy. So I'm pretty sure I'm God's son. I think it's actually better translated here that Satan says, you know what, since you're God's son, why don't you just eat? You don't need to suffer. You don't need to do this. You don't need to go through any of this. Why don't you just feed yourself since you're God's son? And at the heart of this temptation is the question, are you sure you trust God? See, what God told you is that if you suffer now, it'll lead to something greater later. That if you undergo some kind of suffering now, you'll lead to something greater later. But are you sure? Are you sure that's what will happen? What if you come out the end of this fast and you're just like, what was the point of that? I don't feel much closer to God. I don't feel... What if at the end of this, you suffered needlessly? Why? Why do it anyway? You believe in God. You're fine with God. You're on good terms with God. Why? No. Do you really trust God? Do you really trust that his way will work? Are you sure? At the heart of this temptation is that question. And the next temptation is the same way. In Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 5 there, this is what it says. Then the devil took him up and revealed to him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. That used to always sound really kind of like unbelievable. How did that work? And then we invented Google Earth, and we're like, okay, like this isn't quite as insane as it used to be. Then devil showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. I will give you the glory of these kingdoms and authority over them, the devil said, because they are mine to give to anyone I please. I will give it all to you if you will worship me. Takes him up and shows him all the kingdoms and says, I'm going to give this all to you if you'll worship me. And again, at the heart of this temptation is the exact same thing. Are you sure you trust God? Because God has told Jesus this, I will make you Lord of all these nations. The verse that we read last week in Philippians chapter 2, Paul says that Jesus left everything, left being God, left heaven, left all that to come serve and sacrifice for us. And on the other end of that, he will be given a name that will make every knee bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord. You see, Jesus had been promised, you will be the Lord of everything. You will be king. You will be in charge. That's already been promised to Jesus. But to get there, he's going to have to go through a lot. To get there, he's going to have to go through a really messy ministry where he's going to have people doubt him. He's going to have people who just kind of shake their heads at him. He's going to have to endure pain. He's going to have to endure people trying to kill him. Even in his hometown of Nazareth, they take him up to the edge of a cliff to push him off because they want him dead. He's going to have to go through thousands of people believing in him and coming to him and thinking, man, it's Jesus. I think he's got it figured out. And then weeks later, having thousands of people turn on him and say, no, we don't want any part of that. Too much, too radical, not for us. Not what we were looking for. He's going to have people, he's going to have to deal with his disciples who just don't get it. Over and over again, he teaches them, no, this is the way things are. This is the way it should be. And at the end of his ministry, after teaching them about love and sacrifice, after teaching them about putting others first, at the end of his ministry, you have them arguing and bickering over who will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And they just don't get it. Jesus is going to go through a very, very messy, painful ministry at times. And Satan says, why do that? Are you sure? Are you sure that's the best way? I mean, do you really trust God to come through? Because there are going to be times in your ministry where things are going to look rough. I mean, the first thing he did is he sent you out into the wilderness to fast. Are you sure you can trust God? Is he really going to come through at the end of this? Here's the deal. You bow down and worship me once. And that's all he's saying. The verb there is in the aorist tense, and it has the idea of just a one-time action. Do this once. Worship me once. I will give you all that. You don't have to go through all that messy ministry. You don't have to go through all that dealing with people. I mean, come on, people are the worst part of ministry. You know that. You don't have to deal with that. You can have all the kingdoms of the world right now. You really trust God's way? Do you really trust God? The last temptation, where Satan takes him up on top of a building. Luke chapter 4, verse 9, starting in verse 9, says, Then the devil took him to Jerusalem to the highest point on the temple and said, If you are the Son of God, jump off. Now again, that might not sound like a great temptation, but there was a rabbinic teaching at the time that the Messiah would appear to the people on the highest point of the temple. That was kind of something that the people thought might happen. When the Messiah comes, he'll appear to us on the highest point of the temple. So here you are, you're on the highest point of the temple, and Satan says, hey, get those people's attention, jump off. God will catch you, and you don't have to go to the cross. See, you're supposed to be the Messiah. You're supposed to lead people to God and draw them closer to God. You're going to do this great, wonderful thing of reconnecting God and his people. Guess what? I can do that for you, and you don't have to go to the cross. These people will believe in you, and you don't have to die. And you see, the temptation is there at the heart of this again, is the same thing. Do you trust God? See, God promised that if you die, that's the way the Messiah is supposed to function, that's his purpose. He's going to accomplish something through that. And after you die, I will raise you from the dead. But are you sure you trust him? Are you sure you'll be raised from the dead? I don't think you've ever been resurrected before Jesus. Are you sure he'll come through for you? Are you sure? You'll have to go through a lot of pain and suffering. You'll be up there for everyone to see, everyone to make fun of, to poke fun at. You'll be on the cross. Are you sure that you can trust God to raise you from the dead? When you have nails in your hands and your feet, are you sure you can trust God? Are you sure? Because see, my way would be a lot simpler. Jump off here, everyone will believe you're the Messiah. Everyone will follow you. Just jump. It'll work. Are you sure you can trust God? At the heart of every one of these temptations is, are you sure God's way is the best way? God's way sometimes costs you stuff. God's way sometimes will cost you pain. It'll cost you time, money. I mean, it will hurt you. It might cost you friends. It might cost you socially. God's way will cost you sometimes. Are you sure that you can trust God? At the heart of every one of these temptations is the same thing that he's been saying since the book of Genesis. Did God really say that? Do you really think God will do that? Are you sure? Are you sure? And you know what? The thing is that this temptation, these temptations that Jesus faced, the heart, the message of these temptations is the same one that's in every single temptation we face today. And are you sure you can trust God? And there's a couple things that means for us. The first thing is just that every one of your temptations is ultimately about trust. Every single one of your temptations is a trust issue. That's what it comes down to. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, I don't really think that my temptation, the thing I struggle with, doesn't seem to affect my trust in God. No, I trust God, like I believe in God. I'm on God's team. I'm fine with God. I don't think it's a trust issue, but it is. Every temptation that you deal with is ultimately a trust issue. What Satan is saying is that can you really trust God? I mean, for all those of you who are single and you're dating someone, and man, they're cute, and they're handsome, and they're nice, and they're thoughtful, and they're perfect, and they're sweet, and it's just so wonderful, and you want to be with them in a more intimate way. But God said, no, see, that is reserved for marriage. You got to wait. And you're there, and you're struggling, and I want to be with them, and I want to be with them in this more intimate way. I want to get to know them in this way, but I'm supposed to wait. God says I'm supposed to wait. And that temptation might not feel like a trust issue, but at the heart of that, Satan is saying, are you sure you can trust that waiting will be better? I mean, are you sure you can trust that? Do you trust God when he says, no, this is the plan. This is the way things work. I have designed marriage to contain that. I have designed that. So just wait. And Satan says, are you sure that waiting will work? I mean, what if you wait and it doesn't seem like it made any difference? What if you wait and you guys break up? What if you wait and you never meet anyone then? I mean, what if waiting actually hurts? Are you sure you can trust God that waiting's the best way to do this? And it ultimately comes down to trust. Every temptation we face, and it doesn't seem like it, are you sure? But it's a trust thing. When you are tempted to get on your computer and look at something that you shouldn't, it comes down to a trust thing. Do I really need to deny myself this? It says that I'm only supposed to have eyes for one person, but is that really the best way? What's wrong? It's just a personal thing. It's just me. And all the time Satan's saying, can you really trust that God will come through, that it'll be better if you don't do this, if you deny yourself this? Can you really trust that? Do you really trust that if you forgive that person, that'll be better? Won't they just walk all over you? Won't they just abuse your forgiveness? Won't they just take your forgiveness and throw it right back at you? Won't they just continue to do those harmful things? God says to forgive, but can you trust God when he says that? Are you sure that that's the best way? Because it doesn't seem like it will be. It's going to cost you something. You're going to be embarrassed. It's going to be humiliating for you to forgive them again. But God says that you should forgive. Are you sure? Can you trust him? Every temptation we face, and it doesn't seem like it, and I'm not sure how they're connected, but it comes down to a trust issue. For those of you who are new Christians or new to the church, everyone's busy and you're busy, and the question is, can I trust God with more of my time? If I start giving more, if I step it up, if I start stepping out in faith, and I decide to volunteer or help out, or I'm going to be part of this project, or I'm going to help more at church, or be more involved, and I'm busy, I'm so busy, am I sure that this will work? And the whole time Satan's saying, no, you don't need to do that. You're comfortable where you're at. You're fine where you're at. You're at church at least, aren't you? You're there at least, aren't you? That's something. You don't need to do anymore. Do you really trust that God will take care of you if you step out and give more time? And for those of you who are our elders and who are the seniors and the leaders in this church, the temptation is to just give less. I've put in my time. I've done my thing. I've served, I've sacrificed, and now it's time for people to start serving and sacrificing for me. And the temptation is, do you really trust God that if you pour into the new generation, do you really trust God that if you pour into those who are younger, that it'll work out okay? I mean, are you sure it will? How can you trust that? How can you trust their way of doing things? Do you really trust God that he can take care of the next group just like he took care of your group? And the temptation is just to kind of sit back. All the temptations that we, each and every one of us, struggle with comes down to Satan saying, are you sure you can trust God? Are you sure you can trust God? And you know what? That leads to the second thing. Because every one of your temptations is about trust, the second thing that this tells us is that there's always more at stake when you're tempted than you realize. There is always more at stake with temptation than you realize. You don't realize it, you can't see it, you're not sure about it, but there is always more at stake than you think that there is when you're tempted. Because ultimately, temptation is about trust in God. You see, the thing is, we have such a bad idea of thinking that our sin is our own problem. And we don't think that, this little thing, this is my deal, this is my thing, this is all that's at stake. It's just 30 minutes on this computer. It was just that comment I made. I raised my voice. It was just this, this one sin. It wasn't that big a deal. And we diminish sin. We tell sin's not that, this one thing, yes, it was wrong, I'm sorry, but it's not that big a deal. And yet there's always more at stake with your sin than you realize. There is always more on the line than you realize. You see, with your sin, when you're tempted, your future's at stake. Your future's at stake. See, God made you. He put you together. And he said, this is the way you're supposed to live. And so when you sin, when you live not that way, you risk damaging yourself permanently. You risk damaging yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually. You put your future at risk because God's the one who put you together. And so when you sin, you hurt yourself. You risk your future. When you sin, you put other people's futures at risk. When you're tempted, other people's futures are at stake. See, we have this terrible idea in the West. Not so bad in the East, but we have this terrible idea in Western culture that my sin is my problem. That my sin is a personal thing. I will take care of it. I will deal with it. It's my issue. But in the Bible, sin is always communal. That your sin will affect those around you. That your sin will affect your children and your spouse. That your sin will affect your friends and your coworkers. Your sin will affect your community and your church. Your sin is always communal. And when you sin, you have the potential to put someone else's future at risk. That's why there's such this clear indication in the Old Testament that if you don't follow my law, your family to the 4th and 5th generation will suffer. And it's not that God says, because you sin, I'm going to punish your kids. It's because you sin, your kids won't know me. Because you're a drunk, because you're abusive, because you're never there, your kids will grow up hating you and me. And because of your sin, your kids will never know me. That your sin can affect other people dramatically. And when you're tempted, your faith is at stake. When you're tempted, your faith is at stake. And the reason is goes right back to the fact that temptation is about trust. See, you have a cord attached to you and God. It's the cord of your faith. It's your relationship to Him. And that relationship is made up of a bunch of different little strands. And every time you sin, you break one of those because you're saying, I don't trust you, God. Every temptation is a trust issue. Every temptation is are you sure you trust God to do this? Are you sure you trust Him to come through with this? And when you give in, you say, no, I don't trust Him. And so every time you say that, you break a little bit of that cord. And eventually the potential is there for that cord to snap. And you see, anytime you see someone who used to be a Christian and walked away from God, they didn't do that because of an intellectual reason. Now, they come up with intellectual reasons later. Oh yeah, well it's this and this, and this is why I'm not a Christian. I used to be and I wasn't because of this reason, and science, and these people and hypocrites, and they have their reasons. But they didn't walk away from God because of those reasons. See, you don't walk away from God because of an intellectual reason. You behave your way away from God. Little by little, quarter at a time, a chip on the foundation. Every time you're tempted, the question is, do you trust God? And every time you give in, you say, I don't really trust God here. And eventually you get to the point where you don't trust God at all. And really all faith is trust. And so you don't really believe in God anymore at all. When you are tempted, there is always more at stake than you realize. There is always more at jeopardy than you can see. Sin is never a small deal. So here's what we do about it. We start trusting God more. Now, I know that sounds simple and overly, simple, and does that mean we just kind of like, I'm going to trust God more? Okay, I've done it. Yeah, I've reached that new plateau of trust. That's not necessarily what that means. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. But when we start trusting God, there's a couple things that goes into that. You see, the first thing is we can strengthen that cord, that rope of our faith by increasing our trust, by trusting God more. And one of the ways we do that is you do the work ahead of time, okay? This is all, every time you ever hear anybody talking about reading the Bible, praying to God, all that is ways to increase your trust. Because all that does is increase your relationship. When you read God's word, you're talking with God. When you pray, you're talking with God. It just increases your relationship. And as your relationship increases, your trust increases. The closer you get with someone, the more you trust them. If some stranger walks up to me and says, hey, your car's on fire, I might just be like, well, whatever, But if my wife comes in screaming and says, our car's on fire, I'm going to trust her a little more. Okay? I have a close relationship with her. I trust when she says something. And the closer your relationship you have with God, the more that trust builds. And again, we have this idea that, reading the Bible doesn't seem like that big a deal. I read it, and it doesn't seem to change much. Let me tell you, you're not going to come to the Bible and read a couple chapters and all of a sudden have your whole life blown away, That's not the way it works. And you come and you think, well, I did the Bible study for a couple days, and I didn't seem to really gain anything out of it. That's not the way it works, okay? This is having just a meeting with God. I'm going to come to the Bible. We're going to have a little meeting here. And I'm going to come away with a little bit more trust in God, with a little bit stronger view of God. When you go to prayer, most of the time, occasionally it might happen, but most of the time, you're not going to get up from prayer and be like, I am now the best Christian I know. That just changed my life. That one prayer, 5 minutes alone in my bedroom, and I'm just super Christian. It's not the way it works. But every time you pray, you have a little meeting with God, and you get a little closer to God. And so one of the things that we can do is beforehand, put in the work beforehand and increase our trust in God by increasing our relationship with God. But here's the bottom line about all this is temptation, when you're tempted, it ultimately comes down to this, that there's a choice that has to be made. There's a choice that has to be made. Temptation isn't either good or bad, it's just there. And you have to choose which way to go. You will never sin accidentally. Okay? You're never going to, you're not going to get to heaven and God say, whoa, you were such a bad person. I know you never realized it. Like, I know you never knew you were really sinning. But no, all those things you did were terrible. No, you're never going to sin on accident. It's a choice that you will make. And when you're tempted and you're faced with this choice, you have to realize that this is a choice. I can either choose to do something wrong or I can choose to do something right. And when you choose to do right, just like when you choose to do wrong, the opposite happens. When you're tempted and you're asked, do you trust God? Are you sure you can trust him? And you give in. You're saying, no, I can't. But when the temptation comes and you're asked, do you trust God? Are you sure you can trust him? And you say, yes, I can. Then your trust in God grows. Temptation is always a choice. You will never be tempted to such a point that you cannot handle it. The Bible promises you that you will never, ever be tempted beyond your capabilities. You will always have the opportunity to say, no, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm going to stick with God. Temptation is always a choice, and it comes down to, am I going to trust in God or am I going to trust in me? And I'm wrong all the time, okay? Ask Tiffany. I'm wrong all the time. So I'm not going to trust myself. I think I'd much rather trust God. So what does it look like for our church? If our church decides to increase our trust in God, what does that look like? Well, we become more radical servants of God and more radical servants of our community. A church, a group of people, a community that decides to trust in God. A church that trusts in God is a church that puts money where it belongs. Is a church that says, you know what, we need money, we have to have it to operate. We have this wonderful room lit and air conditioned and relatively comfortable, and we need it to pay certain people, and we need money. But it's not our number one priority. It's not our number two priority. It's not even in the top 5. A church that trusts God says, we're not here to protect money, we're here to use our money wisely. A church that trusts God is a church that puts people in their place. That says, you know what, they're going to be our priority. They're going to be the ones that we put the emphasis on. They're going to be in that top 5. They're the ones that we care about, and we want to do things for, and we want to love on them and serve them, and people are our priority at a church that trusts God. A church that trusts God is a church that loves people even if they disagree with them. And I'm not saying you're right. I'm not saying that your belief system is correct or the right one. I'm not saying that everything's hunky-dory. I'm not saying any of that, but you know what? Jesus died for people who didn't agree with him. Jesus died for people who didn't believe in him. He loved people who didn't see eye to eye with him, so we're going to do that too. We're going to continue to love and serve you even if you don't agree. That's fine. That's not going to change how we treat you. A church that trusts in God is a church that does all those things. And as a church, the temptation will always be there to not do that. No, look after your money. No, you can't do that. You need to protect your money. No, you need to worry about the people who are here. You don't need to worry so much about the people who aren't here. No, you know what? You're right. They're wrong. That's what the emphasis should be. As a church, that temptation will always be there. Do you really trust that that's the way that things work? Do you really trust that God's way is the way that things work? I think we can be a church that trusts. We'll always have those temptations, and God's way isn't always easy, but the path that God put us on is the only path that gets to the destination. It's the only path that gets to where we need to go, to this wonderful place where we know God intimately, where we get to walk with God, and where all the wrongs in the world get put right, this incredible, incredible place, that this path, as difficult as it is at times, as much as it costs us at times, is the only path that gets there. And Satan at times will say, hey, there's a shortcut, there's an easier way to do this, I can get you there on my own. But it just doesn't work that way. Will we trust God? Do you trust God? Well, you do. Well, that's good. Now we can get to work. Let's pray. God, we love you. And we thank you for all that you've given to us. God, we just pray that we can remember that as we are going through this life, the temptations that we encounter, whether they have to deal with what we make financially, our families, our children, or whether they have to do with how we treat one another socially, whether they have to do with what we say behind people's backs, all the times that we undergo every little temptation during our week and during this year, that God, we can remember that ultimately it's about our trust in you. And God, I hope that in those moments we can say loudly and confidently, no, I trust God. I'm unwilling to say I don't. I believe in him, and I believe that he's there for me. God, I hope that we can stand on this trust, that we can stand on this confidence as we face temptation in this life, just like your son Jesus did. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.